What we're doing with this project is helping people connect in counties, across counties, urban and rural, and more importantly, kind of repaving the road, both between the people you live near and between counties that sometimes, maybe we're told are separate entities. But so what we're trying to do is reestablish a lot of that connectivity, develop confidence between people, not fear, and really understanding and not hatred. So before we start this conversation here, I want to make sure we thank our other sponsors and the folks that helped make this happen. That was Belmont University, the Reverend Charlie Kerb Center for Faith Leadership, also the Metro Human Relations Commission, and the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation for Greater Nashville, with support from the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and Democracy. So a quick hand to them as well for helping us support. So I'm very happy. I'm at transition to seated and chatty down here. Really excited to be joined by two friends and great Americans, Jonathan Metzl and David French. I think most of you know of them or who they are. Their bios are here. We're not going to spend a ton of time other than to say that, again, they've both been on their own journeys about gun control, but more importantly, about how it affects other elements of American society, both from a health perspective, from the perspective of citizenship, from the perspective of healthy and responsible civil discourse. And I'm really excited to hear their thoughts on this tonight. Jonathan is a professor at Vanderbilt, researcher and writer, and we'll plug it many times, but he's got a great book called Dying of Whiteness, which is already out, but more importantly, he has a brand new book coming out. And what's the name of it? What We've Become. All right, we'll say that about 5 times. Everybody,
I don't know.
That's it. So your phone will be listening to you, and when you log on to Amazon later tonight, it's going to be right there. You're just going to have to order it. And then obviously, wonderful author, scholar, a really critical, great thinker in David French. More importantly, willing to straddle those divides in the country such that he's regularly vilified by people across the political spectrum, which in my book is always a great place to be, right? But he does it with grace and humility and from a level of honest discourse and approach that I think we can all aspire to. He ran a great entity called the Dispatch, where created and crafted a lot of great arguments about the things pressing of the day. He now writes for the New York Times. He's also got a couple books under his belt, and I'm proud to say he's also a veteran of the U.S. military. So really happy to have both these gentlemen with us. And so I guess, I'd love to start this discussion off with is, why are you here? What brought you personally to the issue of gun culture? Before we talk policy, let's just talk, where do you come from? Jonathan?
Well, first, what an honor to be in this room right now. This is what needs to happen. These are the conversations that need to happen. I was just saying at our table back there, put in a room together, Americans could figure out this problem. It's not an impossible problem, and many other problems if we just talk to each other. So I'm honored to be here. I'm also honored to be on this panel because these are men who have changed my thinking about this issue. I'll just say, to jump off just personally, I would say that guns, I'm not a gun owner, and I consider myself a liberal person, but guns have entered my life in three different times, I think, that have kind of shaped my thinking and my feeling. The first is I was born and my dad's a captain in the Air Force, and so I was kind of born on an Air Force base. We were kind of around, people who were trained to use weapons, and it honestly was not a big deal. So early in my life, I was around guns in a way that was just like, hey, this is what you do for your job and what you do to protect your country, and there's specialized training and care and all that kind of stuff, and it just wasn't honestly a big deal at all. It's like kind of like, oh yeah, that's kind of comes with the job, the way a doctor has a stethoscope or something like that. So it just was not a big deal. And so partially, I think those early experiences shaped my sense that, like, why is this so damn polarized? But it just wasn't a big deal. The second was when I was maybe 5 or 6, just kind of by happenstance, I was in a mass shooting. It was not an intentional mass shooting. My family was at the Aspen Music Festival, and somebody was taking rifle practice with a high-power They were shooting at cans a mile away, and bullets started ripping through the tent. A couple of people were shot. We were all down on the ground. My dad is a physician. He went and administered help. And so just this sense of like the terror of being in a safe space and having bullets rip through is one of my very powerful early memories about this is not what we want, right? And I just say it was a very powerful formative memory for me, which was let's protect. It's weird. It's weird to have that happen anyway, but when you're like 6 years old or 7 years old, it's just very formative. So it's kind of like we have to protect the public from this thing happening. And that's been a very important part of my life. And then the other part is I'm a psychiatrist, and I didn't think I was going to study guns in my career. And then when the mass shooting era really started happening with Columbine on down, I just started getting calls after every mass shooting about, is it the mentally ill? And for the first 100 times I was asked that question, I was like, I don't study guns. There's nothing causal about mental illness that leads people to attack other people or shoot people. Then I started thinking like, why am I being asked this question all the time? And it actually changed my entire career because I started really thinking about that question of mental illness and guns. And the answers led me to a bunch of really different places than I think I would have. It led me to, think about stereotypes of gun owners and how we don't talk to each other and stereotypes of people with mental illness. It led me to all these really different places. And so the kind of issue of guns was brought to me as a scholar, and we can talk about that later, kind of against I just didn't have anything to do with it. And then I started paying attention. I'm like, wait a minute, this is a metaphor for a bunch of other bigger things. So.
Dave?
So I was born in small town South, raised in small town South, born in Opelika, Alabama, right outside of Auburn, War Eagle. Raised in Georgetown, Kentucky, which was then a much smaller town right out near Lexington, go Big Blue. And we always had a gun, always. And so from the time I was very young, and my friends had guns, their families had guns, everybody had a gun. And so from the time I was very young, I was taught how to act around guns, how to handle guns. I think the two words that I would say that were the words that were attached to gun ownership were respect and responsibility. You respect the power of the weapon, and you're responsible with it. And there's anyone who's had any training in dealing with firearms, good training in dealing with firearms, knows sort of the commandments of dealing with firearms. And so it was not something that we talked about. It was not something that people didn't talk about their arsenals. It was just a part of life. Most people had guns for some idea that they wanted to hunt, although not that many people hunted. Everyone would say, well, sort of last-ditch self-defense. It was just part of life. And so when I left law school and I started to set up my own household, I bought a gun. It's what you do. You have a gun. And it was for self-defense. I didn't think a whole lot about it. I didn't feel a particular sense of threat. It's just in a house, you have a gun. And so as I got older and I got involved in, was a constitutional litigator for a very long time, got involved in litigating civil liberties, had very specific ideas about what the Second Amendment was intended to protect. I largely agree with the Supreme Court's formulation in both Heller and Bruin that it protects a right to keep guns in the home and to bear them outside the home. And then my attitude towards guns went through two rapid transitions. One was right around 2015 when I was working at National Review, and I came out very strongly as a conservative against Donald Trump. And when that happened, our lives changed as a family. We began to get it began the first of a series of serious threats that we received. And so we began to live a life under threat from people we know had guns. And so we purchased more guns. My wife went and she took classes, not just the handgun carry classes, but she took advanced self-defense classes with a handgun because her view was she would not carry something that she didn't feel very proficient at. I had military experience, so I had training in the use of guns, but I took refresher courses as well. And we viewed that as a very important part of our family's self-defense. We would carry guns outside the home. We had guns inside the home. We taught our children how to use guns. My son got into shooting sports. He shot trap and skeet before he gave it up for football. So now we have a pile of unused shotguns in the house if anyone wants some trap and skeet guns. And so to me, at that point, especially going up until I would say 2018, 2019, my actual experience with much of gun culture was pretty positive in this sense that the people I interacted with had the similar view of guns, respect and responsibility. There was sort of a sense of camaraderie when you interacted with other people who'd experienced threats, empowerment that you were able to defend yourself, that you weren't helpless in the face of external threats. Where we lived, for example, at that time, if we called the police, it might be 10, 15 minutes before anyone would show up. And that's casting no aspersions on the police. We're in rural Murray County between Columbia and Mount Pleasant. So it's just we were far away. And then I began to notice a pretty rapid and really emphatic shift in sort of the way in which guns were treated, and with the words going away from sort of respect and responsibility more towards dominance and aggression. That guns became not so much in the gun culture that I experienced, not so much this is for hunting, this is for self-defense, but also became kind of a identity marker. This is who I am. So you began to see people open carry weapons more frequently. You began to see people open carrying weapons at protests. You began to see people, there'd always been resistance to gun control measures, but you began to see an absolute intolerance towards any sort of idea designed to regulate the use or ownership of firearms, including implacable opposition even to some traditionally accepted forms of restriction on firearms. And I began to see something that I wrote about both at the Dispatch and at the Times, what I would call a gun idolatry. In other words, you began to see guns as an identity marker, the not just the respect for a weapon as a deadly and powerful tool, but one that has its uses, but almost a reverence for it. You began to see the growth of the tactical or black gun lifestyle, where people would essentially LARP. Do y'all know what LARPing is? Live action role play. It's like when people dress up in cardboard armor and with plastic swords and go out and reenact medieval battles. That's LARPing. It's also a term for just sort of like acting like you're something you're not. So you began to see people kind of LARPing like they're special forces, or wearing the same kind of clothing and buying the same kind of weapons that they'd seen that SEALs use. And so this whole LARPing gun reverence culture began to rapidly, the seeds were always there, but just the way in which it just spread really shocked me, really startled me. And then we began to see the unbelievable rise in mass shootings, or rising right alongside this rise in gun idolatry and reverence. And it created a real, it was extremely distressing to me, just extremely distressing, because it's so contrary to the culture that I grew up with that it was alien to it. And so ever since I began to really see this, I've been trying to, on the one hand, sort of talk to my friends who are much more leery of guns, to talk about my family's experience and why it's been and remains very important for us to be able to defend ourselves. And then to turn around to my fellow gun-owning friends and say, you have no idea the way in which the culture change in the gun rights community is warping American culture, and the way in which is laying the seeds, not just for the things like the mass shootings that we have seen, where people are adopting sort of that black gun lifestyle, that tactical lifestyle, and taking it out on others, but also creating a real sense of fear and intimidation in the wider culture. So that's kind of where I am right now, with a foot on each side of the debate.
Yeah, my the journey is kind of similar to that, but very much bifurcated, right? So I grew up in a military family, so we moved all over the place. And so, my first memories, and, my grandfather, he put food on the table by taking a box of 22 shells out into the deserts of Idaho during World War II and shooting literally hundreds of rabbits to sell the skin for gloves for World War II. And that's how he fed the family. And that went through, his 4 sons, who were given rifles, at age 11, and became hunters and shooters and avid sportsmen. And, in my dad's case, joined the military, and that's where I grew up, right? So I was very much in hunting culture. I taken all the safety classes to hunt geese in Maryland. I remember being in South Korea, a place where people can't have personally owned firearms, but they would make an exception for the military, the American military. So the farmers would invite us onto their fields to hunt pheasant because they wanted to get rid of the pheasants. And those were all exceptionally positive experiences about hunting and gun ownership. It wasn't a thing I was super into, but it was something I really respected and appreciated that my dad and my grandfather and all these others, had been lifelong hunters and even earned a living that way at various points in their life. And then I joined the Army myself and went into a whole different culture. And after 22 years in the Army, what I would say is it's always fascinating when people say, well, we give 19-year-olds weapons in the military, how come we can't do it outside? And I say, do you have any conception of just how much training and responsibility goes into a person in the military who carries a weapon? Just the hours upon hours and weeks and months, and heaven forbid that you violate safety protocol with that weapon. There's no better way to scare somebody in the military than if they stand up, walk 10 feet, and realize they don't have their weapon with them, because they know that the wrath of God's about to strike them dead if they don't get to that weapon quickly and reclaim it. And I was carrying a weapon for years on end, like literally every day, within arm's reach or in my hand, for 2 years in Afghanistan, for a long summer in Iraq. And I understood how the military approached guns. I mean, they were very much a lethal tool that we used. And then Sandy Hook happened, and I remember, I'd already put in an order for a commemorative pistol from our deployment. I was in Afghanistan, and I was going to pick up some weapons that had nice little engravings on them with the unit crest and some other things. And I remember walking into my last deployment was out of Fort Campbell. I remember walking into the gun dealership to work out the federal licensing and get it shipped home. And on the table was this thing that says, is your state a state that supports the Second Amendment? And their criteria was, does your state offer no restrictions on the use of silencers or suppressors, as we call them? And I thought, wow, I don't even have a silencer suppressor, but I also know, holy hell, you think guns are dangerous now? A suppressed weapon in a city is just a nightmare of epic proportions. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And it was the first indicator that gun culture had been shifting considerably from what I grew up in. And to David's point, what had happened was we were taking the worst of both worlds. We were taking civilian access to guns in a kind of laissez-faire way, and we were combining it with this culture where it was a signifier of me being tough or me being manly or me being the worst of it, me being an American, somehow that you have to carry a weapon to be a true American. And watching states and nations and failed states where people regularly carried weapons in public spaces, I thought, wow, we're play acting here. Because this idea that more guns is going to yield to more safety, and again, I say this as a gun owner, but I say that we've got to find ways to, we'll get into the discussion of what to do about all this, but we were importing very corrosive images of guns, and I think it does tie to 9/11. It ties to the post 9/11 world. It ties to the wars we were in, where this overwhelming fear of the outside world combined with a complete collapse in faith in our institutions and a complete lack of faith in our fellow Americans has led a lot of people to say, well, the military is this trusted thing. This military is this beautiful organ, and you don't have to agree with me, but there's this organization of patriots who are serving their country. So I can signify that I am also a great American if I, to David's point, if I play act or if I put on the gear of a military person. And most dangerously, the most dangerous part of all this is people have now begun to confuse that with citizenship. So we're in a weird spot, I guess. And so now what I want to turn to is professionally, right? Professionally, we've got these backgrounds. We see issues. How are you engaging?
Well, I'll say, it's such a personal issue, and they're also, I think, first of all, let me just say before I answer that question, just this question of change over time is so important, right? It's so central to all the narratives that we've told. It's also central to the narrative of American attitudes about guns. If you look, for example, at Pew opinion polls about why people own guns in the 70s, 80s, 90s, overwhelmingly people would say hunting or family tradition, passed down, and maybe 15% in 1980 would say fear of other people. And now it's like 85% of people who own guns say, I'm protecting myself. So guns have come to signal protecting ourselves from each other, right? And it's also happened as it's gotten much easier to own a gun, carry a gun without any of this kind of training or anything. And as our rhetoric in our country has become so much more divisive. And so this transition, I just want to highlight it before I answer that question and say that transition is one, we talk about like polarization in America and divisiveness and issues become, I've interviewed a lot of gun owners. I'll say that in a second. But the minute it becomes like a life or death issue, I don't think the people I interview are uninformed, but for them it's a life or death issue. And when guns become their talisman of safety against the world, it's just so deep, right? It's so deep. It's me against you, and my gun is my symbol of that. And so the place I've seen it the most powerful, actually, we talk a lot about mass shootings. It's so important. Actually, my next book is about mass shootings. But it's important to know we have about 50,000 gun deaths a year in this country. Overwhelmingly, most gun death is gun suicide, two-thirds. And so I started up by thinking, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a sociologist, and I thought that story really hasn't been told all that much. We haven't really told the story of gun suicide. What is the story of gun suicide? And so for my research for my book, Dying of Whiteness, I went down to the southernmost part of Missouri, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and I'm from Missouri, and I'm from Kansas City, which is got city in the name, so it's kind of a city, but Cape Girardeau is not a city. It's kind of a rural. I don't know if anybody's been there, but it's many things. It's rural. It's remote. It's very, very, very conservative and gun friendly. Everywhere you go, people have guns. And so I went down there, and I was basically living and talking with people who had lost family members from gun suicide. And part of that story was, what does it mean to lose somebody to gun suicide in an area where guns are everywhere? Like to say, well, I'm against guns now is not an option, right? You take a propeller plane into Cape Girardeau, the cab driver picks you up. He's got 2 weapons in there. You go to the grocery store, there people have weapons. There's guns everywhere. And so people were kind and wonderful and thoughtful, and they let me speak with them. And when I started doing interviews with people, first I would ask them, and this is really honestly very rare for me professionally, but they spoke about gun suicide to me after a long trust building. And the stories I heard about gun suicide were just heartbreaking. And there's some of them in the book. Some of them were so powerful I didn't even put them in the book. But parents who wanted an open casket for their child who accidentally shot himself or on purpose shot himself, but they could only show part of the body in an open casket because only the arm and the leg were not affected by the gunshot, stuff like that. I mean, incredible pain and reckoning. And so people would tell me these stories, and then I don't know, in the first maybe couple months of hearing these stories, I guess I would ask a really liberal question, which was the wrong question. I would say, did this change the way you think about guns? And people would look at me like all of a sudden I was an outsider. Like that was the wrong question, because that meant, and people would say, no, it's not the gun's fault. It's the person's fault. How could you even ask that? And so I ended up dropping that question initially. And I learned a lot because I would say, did I ask the wrong question? And they're like, yeah, you actually just asked the wrong question, because we see guns as a part of our lives in a way. And so I started reframing that question as, what can we do to keep our families and communities safe? Which was how I ended up, like, let's talk about safety. Let's not talk about guns. Because the minute you're talking about the gun as the pathogen, and I guess for me as a liberal person, I thought, if ever there was an instance where like unregulated guns and stuff like that, here's where public health comes in. But what public health didn't account for was the meaning of guns in people's lives. Like guns were also how they understood tragedy. So people didn't become more anti-gun. And I think it just made me think a lot that I had a conceptual misperception, honestly, when I started the project, which is I thought something terrible happens and then people are going to flip over to my side of seeing things. And that is wrong, right? Because when you think about it, when people are challenged, when people are at their most dire, that's the time they're the least likely, right? People find religion when they have cancer. People find God when they are in a plane and the smoke coming out the back or something like that, you know? And so in a way, the idea that basically people were going to change their ideology about guns, it just was such a liberal fantasy. And I realized it when I went down there. And then when I started asking the right question, that's when I really started to understand what guns meant in people's lives. But I guess what this changed for me was seeing now, like, there's a mass shooting. And then everybody's like, what's wrong with you? You don't want background checks? You don't want red flag laws? And it doesn't let people grieve in a way. We're asking the wrong question, the same thing, which is at these moments where we have mass shootings, there's this assumption, everybody's going to become a Democrat because our policies are this particular way. And so I guess the point I'm making is, don't even get me started. I think the NRA is a horrible entity in terms of its effect on the judiciary. I think the role of the gun lobby on our judges is really a serious problem. But I would also say it made me realize how my own liberal bias about assuming something bad happened and then people were going to flip to my side, I started to see that pattern a lot more. And in a way, it just has changed my idea about like what conversations I want to have with people. And does this make sense? I'll pass it to David because I maybe riff off of that a little bit. But it's kind of like, how do we have conversations? And I think a lot of times we go into the conversation assuming somebody's going to change their identity to come to our position, as opposed to like, how can we keep everybody safe? Which to me is how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's meeting people where they are is absolutely critical. And so this is my entry. So there's two aspects to this. One, I've had a lot of success in meeting people where they are, in this phrase that is used again and again by the Supreme Court in both the Heller decision and the Bruin decision last 2 terms ago. Responsible, law-abiding gun ownership. Responsible, law-abiding. If you're going to build agreement with people around the right of responsible, law-abiding citizens to own guns, what does it mean to be responsible and law-abiding? And so you're going to actually get a lot of agreement with people who would say that there is a degree of irresponsibility a person can exhibit that should strip them of the right to own a weapon. So here's one that most people agree with, although the Supreme Court's going to decide whether this is grounds for removing a weapon. But for example, if you're subject to a domestic violence restraining order, if you have indicated that you might be a threat to another family member, to your spouse, to your girlfriend, you are not responsible. You are not responsible. Other other kinds of restrictions that there's a broad agreement about. People who have been convicted of felonies, for example. Well, you are not law-abiding. So when you can walk into this argument that says responsible and law-abiding, what does that mean? How we want to build a culture of responsibility, and we want to have laws that are carefully drawn that protect the public. How do we put those things together? And what I have found is that you can actually get a high degree of agreement, and this is not remotely news to anyone probably in this room. If you're here, you probably have more interest in this debate than the average person. So you're going to know that there are a lot of gun control measures that are tied to individual behavior that have broad support. So background checks, which tie you to criminal, possibility of a criminal past, that goes to law abiding. The red flag laws that are mentioned, they go to responsibility. Are you someone who's indicating by your behavior that you're responsible? So these things have a lot of public support, but, and here's the but. The but is that broad degree of public support is often broad but shallow. So if you have a poll that says 70% of Tennesseans support X or Y gun control measure, let's say red flag laws, just for the sake of argument, 70% support red flag laws. You're going to lose to the 30% every time if the 30% care more and control the GOP. So in that sense, it's not just breadth of support, it's intensity of support. And so how do we talk about engage people on intensity? Now, this is where it gets really difficult, because what's happened is that gun ownership is now being tied to identity, and not just tied to identity, it's also being tied to masculinity. Okay, so we have a crisis of masculinity in this country. We have people who we don't need to go into all of the statistics, but while men at the sort of the tip of the spear, the most educated, et cetera, are doing really well, they disproportionately have board seats and they're disproportionately in C-suites. They're disproportionately generals and politicians and all of that. Your average guy is falling behind your average woman educationally, falling behind in much more likely to die deaths of despair, much more likely to be both a perpetrator and a victim of crime. I mean, you just go through the list, and there's this siren song out there coming from part of this country that's like, if you want to restore your dignity, your self-worth, your sense of masculinity, your sense of toughness, all of these things are going to be wrapped up in firearms. And it's incredibly potent. You can look at the advertising. There was a lawsuit filed by the parents of Sandy Hook victims over some of the advertising for the kind of weapon used in Sandy Hook. And if you look at the advertising, it's like basically be a man, Even though the actual people, and you know this very well, someone who is in special forces or who is in infantry, looks at these guys walking around and doesn't think, oh, that's a formidable warrior. It's more like MEAL Team 6, but it's so tied to identity. And so one of the things that, I've learned is you can't replace something with nothing. You can't say to somebody who's finding a lot of meaning and purpose in this tactical lifestyle, this black gun lifestyle, in the open display of weapons, in centering their life around, you've heard the phrase God, guns, and Trump, like the big three. You can't just sweep aside the firearms and leave nothing in its place. So we really do, as a culture, need to work on establishing and upholding a virtuous idea of masculinity that is not so dependent on peacocking displays of aggression. Something that when I was growing up, we would not think of as manly at all. We would not think of that as cool. We would have thought it was weird. We would have thought someone was a poser. And so there's a lot that's at stake here. One is the legal framework. What does it mean as a matter of law to codify responsible law abiding? That's a whole conversation. The other one was, what does it mean as a matter of culture to separate a person's meaning and self-worth away from a firearm? A firearm does not provide those things. And if you're looking for a firearm to provide those things, it is empty, it is dark, and it is dangerous.
No, I think that's and I appreciate it. We'd love having Dave here just because the legal side of it, right, is and a lot of times these arguments would be caught up in the legalisms. And as John alluded to with the number of guns in the country, as David alluded to with, the laws are what they are, and they take a long, long time to change. It was a 40-year project to assert where the Second Amendment is now. It'll probably be another 40-year project for anybody who would like to roll back kind of the legal understanding of where it is now. But there is this piece of culture where my main focus is, as somebody who's studied how the civilian worlds and the military interact and how images of the military kind of shape the way civilians often, particularly young men, want to act. And I think, that when you look at the way guns are looked at in culture, it's all rights and no responsibility. And it's amazing to me because it's a very shallow and immature approach to something that's so potent and so dangerous. And the idea that people would want to dress up or play act or talk online like they want to go kill somebody is just amazing to me. Or even the idea that somebody thinks that they're going to be in a shootout and be the hero, right? I will tell you, the scariest place to be in a combat zone is in a large mess hall with, about this many people or more. Because everybody's armed, right? You're in a combat zone, you just happen to be in the mess hall. That is the scariest place to be, because if a gun went off, somebody shot, or heaven forbid, somebody ran into that mess hall, even though everybody's trained, that would be the last place on earth I would ever want to be. Not for fear of whatever was coming in, but being shot by the guy to my left, my right, the young MP who's fumbling with his weapon, the mechanic who's been trained more, again, baseline, more than any civilian, is now picking up a weapon in a moment of panic in a crowded room and trying to shoot somebody and trying to shoot the right person. And what we never grapple with is it's not a video game. And when you shoot the wrong person, that's a lifelong trauma event, right? That is not a fun thing. And I would tell you, even when you shoot the right person or somebody you've been told is the right person, that's a lifelong trauma event. And so as we look, right, at the way the military approaches guns, what we're learning about guns, I will tell you, the closest friends I've had die over the last 22 years are guys that I buried in Arlington because they weren't shot in combat, but they got home, were having marital strife, large problems at home, didn't know how to deal with it, and they had easy access to a firearm, and they shot themselves. Those are the men I've buried at Arlington the most. This morning, 8 hours ago, we buried a guy by the name of Ian Fishback. A little bit different story, but he was a young American who stood up and said, we should not be torturing or mistreating Iraqi detainees, because he saw their humanity, and he knew we didn't always get it right. And he said, we are not going to torture these people. And for someone like him to stand up, and he was excoriated for it, eventually led to the passage of a major piece of legislation. I would encourage you all on the day of his burial to read about him and honor his memory. But for him to stand up and do that, he understood the power of violence. He understood the negative lifelong consequences, and he refused, as you are forced to when you're actually confronted with violence, to dehumanize the other person or to treat this act of violence or this threat of violence as a game. And I think that's the fundamental challenge we have in culture, setting aside, I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue, what are the right laws, what's the right mix. We need to pursue healthcare, but by God, most of all, we have to address this culture that takes the awesome responsibility of gun ownership and takes it lightly and treats it again as a symbolizing thing versus the dramatic, devastating tool it is and can be. So what's next?
Well, I mean, I was thinking about that. I think it's an important question as we think about our conversations here. And I just want to say two things that I think are important to bring up in this conversation. One is kind of the looming question of race. Race is such an important aspect here. Race and gun ownership, race and gun victimhood, race and neighborhoods. There's also an important historical issue about race that I've studied a lot, which is in the 1960s, for example, when the NRA was starting to rev up, and everybody's like, yeah, gun rights, gun rights, gun rights. And then Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael and, Black Panthers, and they're like, yeah, gun rights, Malcolm X. And everybody's like, well, actually, not really. So that's, Gun Control Act of 1968. And so this question of kind of race and gun ownership. Black Americans, Black communities have historically supported gun control more than white Americans. Black Americans supported the crime bill in the 1990s that is, so problematic now because they had seen the effect of assault weapons in their neighborhoods. Something's different happening now. We're almost in an arms race in our own country. You're seeing a lot of Black and brown Americans who are owning guns more and not supporting gun safety, Black gun owning organizations. And so the question is this a good thing or a bad thing? People think, oh, I need guns. Certainly after George Floyd, there was a lot of advertising and marketing toward Black communities saying the police aren't going to protect you or you need guns against the police. So all roads are kind of leading to more guns. And I would say that race is another really important part of this story that is part of this transformation and one that I think we need to pay attention to. Now, this is like, how much, we have till 8:15? Yeah. So we had 45 minutes of bummer. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And the hard part is I like that we're going back to kind of conversations on our tables here after this conversation, because the issue is like, I'll just say first, and I said at our table, I think our political system is broken to fix this problem, honestly. I think, we probably disagree about Bruin. I just think the language of Bruin was so broad. I think some of the language about stand your ground laws where people don't have a duty to retreat anymore, where just the laws are not encouraged. There's no space for people to sit together and figure this out in a way. And so I think it's got to be people sitting around tables and in their communities that actually figure out this problem now, and then go back and lead the leaders, right? I think the leaders are dropping the ball in a certain kind of way now. And so I think these conversations are so important, but it's also like, what's the end point of this conversation? And when I talk to liberal friends of mine, and they're like, we want red flag laws and we want background checks and we want them mandated and we want them, and I just think, and I agree, those are things I want too. You could have a background check and a red flag law for every single person. We're still going to have exactly the same problem. It might reduce gun deaths. Red flag laws, about a 15% reduction if everybody did it. In gun suicide is where they're the most effective. But the issue of guns isn't just a health issue. It's a political issue. And so if we're not also talking about the divisiveness of these particular issues, in my new book, I argue actually that we should get away from public health mandates and start thinking about what makes communities safe. So I'm kind of making a plea for, let's really think really seriously about community safety in a way that brings together people across the divide. Because I just think that no side has the answer. And every side is kind of falling back into either we're arguing we want red flag laws and background checks, which I want those things, or we want more guns, but we're kind of like, you see this thing unraveling in a way. And so I think the question is just developing a common language that's not the same old kind of conversation where we're having this conversation where everybody knows the answer before they talk to the other person. How can we really, really talk to people about this issue? How can we really think about community safety, about neighborliness, about communities, and also about not just our own community, but the community next to you in a way? How can you incentivize communityness? I'm coming from the healthcare world, and I'll just say the last thing about this is when they first had the Affordable Care Act, there was this great idea in the Affordable Care Act. How can you get people to collaborate with each other to promote health? And their idea was basically, let's take an entire city like Nashville. Let's create some metrics. Like if the whole community lowers its systolic blood pressure lowers its rate of ER visits, builds more parks and more bike lanes. If the whole community does it, not just one block or one neighborhood, the whole community gets a tax break. And so what they did was they incentivized people to work with other people who were not just on their own block and say, hey, there's a reward for us if we build conduits, and we can incentivize then something which everybody in Tennessee wants, which is the tax break, which is the most important thing everybody wants. And I thought, like, this is brilliant, right? Because you're actually incentivizing people. It's not a government telling you to do something. It's like there's going to be a reward. We're thinking about how do we get people to work together. And I always think, like, we should do that with gun violence also, incentivize people working together to create public space, lower these kind of metrics in a way that's not about like this mandating thing, which is what we've gotten into. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a lesson there, except to say, I will say, when people have tried this healthcare thing, it actually does work in small communities, and there's got to be something along those lines. I just feel like this conversation needs to change in a way that is about building communities and community connections, that is not about the preformed rhetoric that we have.
I think we have a huge Homer Simpson problem.
Where he falls back into the ivy?
Yeah, yes. There's this famous GIF, you'll see it all over, where Homer Simpson with eyes wide retreats back into the bushes. And so what you have in this country is a disaffected, alienated, exhausted majority. This has been, there's this group called More in Common that has done a lot of research on what's called the hidden tribes of America. What they found is we're not exactly red and blue. There's some hyper red and there's some hyper blue, and then about 70% of us are what are called the exhausted majority, where people who are left, middle, and right are extremely discontent, not just with sort of the state of our laws, but the state of our culture as well. But the problem is the operative word isn't majority, it's exhausted. And so I'm sure you guys have experienced this. If you say something on social media, whether you have a public platform or you don't, you just have a platform with friends and family, and one of them maybe who's part of the hyper-polarized wings doesn't like what you say, things get unpleasant really fast. And most of us just don't want to deal with it. We don't like to deal with it. I was talking to a doctor friend some time ago, and he was talking, this was after January 6th. He's a staunch Republican, and he just said, I'm out. I deleted all my social media. I turned off Fox. I pay no attention. The most stressful thing I think about is University of Tennessee football, which is stressful. But, and he said, my blood pressure's lower. I'm a better dad. I'm a better husband. And I thought, good for you, bad for us, right? Because somebody who's reasonable and thoughtful and considerate and compassionate checked out. And that's the logical, most expedient thing for any given individual to do. If you have a real sense of hopelessness about the political culture, if you have a sense of hope, forget politics for a minute, if you have a sense of hopelessness about the larger culture, being able to push back against your community's values and norms that you see drifting in a negative way, and you retreat, you essentially cede all of that to the people who are the loudest and the most aggressive. And this dynamic is everywhere. It's very much in the gun rights debate. It's very much in any discussion when guns come up. And so this is what we have to combat. Is what we have to do is we have to take that exhausted majority and make the operative word majority and not exhausted. And that's very difficult, but it's far from hopeless. It's not like mores change one way or cultural norms change one way, and they just never change back. If they changed in one direction, they can change in another. But I do think, to go back to your point, it is so important to meet people where they are and to speak to them in the language and terms that connects with their values. That's why I emphasize responsible, law-abiding gun ownership, because I've never met a gun owner who says, no, I'm against responsible, law-abiding gun ownership. No, connect with that. And I was listening to this fantastic podcast that Malcolm Gladwell did. I don't know if you guys followed this, but he had a debate in Canada over, is the mainstream media Can you trust the media? And not only did he lose the debate, he lost the debate by the most lopsided margin. It was one of these debates where people go in and they signal their pre-existing position and then where they are at the end. And he got slaughtered, just slaughtered. And so he literally went to debate school and he put this out on a podcast. And he said, I went into that debate believing that I was right and seeking the applause of my allies. He said, that was the dumbest thing that I possibly could have done. What I do is when I am in a debate, when I'm in discourse, I am 100% focused on meeting the people that I disagree with and speaking to them. I've got my allies, but what about the people who are on the fence? What about the people who disagree? What are their values? How do I connect with them? And that's why I think it is so important to have gun owners, people who do support, sort of the more modern, the more recent Supreme Court readings of the Second Amendment, to come in and say, look, I am in no way, shape, or form saying you don't have a right to defend yourself. In fact, I've owned a gun my entire life. There's been a gun in my family. But we have a problem right now, and the problem is responsibility and the responsible law-abiding gun owner is under siege. And that responsibility prong and that law-abiding prong are both under threat. What can we do about it? And you can connect with people. But at the same time, you also have to steel their spines, or they're going to walk out of the bush. They're going to take one look around, get about 3 Facebook posts in response, and they're going to walk right back into those bushes. And so they need to have a sense of community and support. And I do think, honestly, I have seen some signs of hope. I really have. There are a number of people I talk to who their minds are more open than they used to be. I'll put it that way. And so I do see signs of hope. I do see signs that people are discontent. They don't like to turn on TV and see guys armed with AR-15s shutting down business in the Michigan House of Representatives, right? They don't like, that is not what they want to see. They don't want to walk into a CVS like I did a couple of years ago. Now, the guy in front of me was strapped at CVS with 2 pearl-handled pistols. Now, I was of 2 minds. One, I'm like, do you really need 2 pearl-handled pistols? One on each hip to, pick up I don't know what kind of medication. On the other hand, they were cool pistols. But this idea, people don't like that. Just this week in downtown I live right outside of Franklin. And in downtown Franklin, there was this dude just walking around downtown with an AR and a tri-corner hat. And nothing says I'm totally mentally stable than walking around in a tri-cornered hat and apparently loaded semi-automatic assault weapon. That makes people nervous. And so that connects me with the last value. Okay, if people say responsible, law-abiding, they can agree. Here's another thing that people will agree to a lot, especially here in the Bible Belt, in principle, if not in practice, the golden rule. The golden rule. Treat others the way you would like to be treated. And is it the case that you would like others to intentionally make you fearful and nervous? Is that the way you treat your neighbors, your fellow citizens? If that's not the way you would like to be treated, why would you support a culture that seems to be designed to intentionally trigger fear and anxiety in others? That's a direct violation of the golden rule. So again, find the values, connect with the values, and then be patient and persistent. And the last bit is courageous. You can't Homer Simpson it. You can't retreat in the bushes. That doesn't mean be the biggest jerk in the room, be a bigger jerk than they are. Engage with respect and engage with compassion, but don't relent.
And I think that framing is really perfect because, nobody likes mass shootings. Right? I'm pretty sure we don't poll it even. That's how sure we are that nobody likes it. We don't poll it. Nobody likes mass shootings, but then now think about how the argument always proceeds at the end of one. When you say, well, I think, to Jonathan's point, well, I think we need to do X, and we say, whoa, or, hey, how come you're not willing to support this? And the assumption is always a little bit, to a degree, one of attack. It's one of, well, now we're going to go here on these issues that are dear to you. And I think there's room there for a little bit of grace and a little bit of a pause in terms of, and I'm not saying I do not agree, well, we can never talk about it as long as there's a mass shooting, right? Because there's always a mass shooting. So we have to talk about it now. So I'm not saying no, don't talk about it when it's raw and real, but I'm saying talk about it in that way. The question is not, well, gee, they just disengaged. The question is, why did they disengage? And in my view, it always comes down to trust. They are, folks on both sides are always led to believe in this polarized world that, well, you're telling me something that sounds fairly reasonable, straightforward, but I know you have an ulterior motive. I know you've got another agenda. You're asking for this, but what you really want is this. And in gun culture, it becomes something, because it's so tied, right? Part of a militia being essential, and these images of people rising up and defending themselves and fighting for freedom, it can really hit that core of American identity when you approach these issues. It's okay to be clumsy, but more important to be honest about it. And again, build the trust first, because otherwise, we're just backing up, right? All of us are hiding in the bushes. We come out, we shout, we post one Facebook post, we say, okay, well, I'm not going to talk to Aunt Sue for another 6 months, and we retreat, right? And then we see the other on Thanksgiving, and we have a conversation that deep, and then we retreat till Christmas, and we're not going anywhere. So on that note, we're at an hour, and I want to say, please take something from what one of these two gentlemen said and figure out, what can you do? How can we have a conversation that, one, engenders trust, engenders meaning, and might actually make a difference?